Good morning, everyone, and thanks to all the organizers for having me here. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Technical University of Munich with the Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, and the title of my presentation is pretty long, following the spirit of the conference. And I would like to start talking about the meaning of this idea of reenactment in this context. As the resurgence of postmodernist approaches we are currently witnessing, despite the backlash against them, calls for a rereading of reenactment of postmodernism meant in its potentiality to reinscribe the objects in the acta, in their events as stratified artifacts, and in their records, in their different pasts, in the ways they are transmitted. And within this transmission, postmodernism as a discursive formation more than as a style may then be able to come to rescue in the clash between destruction and preservation that continuously shape the tangible and intangible substance of cities. Against the constant battlefields of misunderstanding and misinterpretation, where urban heritage hangs between radical change and radical stasis, threatened by the risk of both pristine preservation and oblivious erasures, postmodernism may re-emerge as a translation device by virtue of its capability of embodying the contradictions and ambiguities inherent to the paradox of reconstructing an essence. And the issue becomes even more profound when it comes to heritage crusades rooted into the vicissitude of authoritarian systems of power. On the one hand, calling into play the iconicity of an imaginary connected to right or wrong symbolic values, and on the other hand, acting through iconoclastic gesture against the past that they attempt to erase. To investigate into the possibilities of translation through postmodernism, I would like to employ a stratified term introduced by Walter Benjamin in The Task of the Translator. The word in question is the German Fortleben, which acquires, in Benjamin's text, the double meaning of afterlife and survival. A duplicitous, hyper-dense concept which cannot be fully translated, Fortleben incorporates within itself something intimately related to the living, the idea of living on, living after, living beyond. Transposed to the syncopated rhythm of cities, in the Fortleben perspective, preservation processes can turn into a coexistent and relation of multiple dimensions, in which continuity and metamorphosis may find reconciliation, and heritage being liberated for its still life status, achieving the trait of transmissibility that stands as the basis of the very notion of inheritance. Drawing an analogy between Benjamin's interpretation of translation issues as moving forth from the original they come from, in the condition of postmodernism, the resurgence is somehow also a survival. Survival and afterlife meet, collide and overlap in the controversial vicissitudes of construction, destruction and reconstruction of a paradigmatic urban artifact in a contested space, whose current image is shaped by the processes of translation and mistranslation involved in the transmission of this legacy to posterity, object of censorship and icon of a liberation. With the construction of medieval origins, a destruction rooted in the iconoclastic events of the communist East Germany, and an iconic reconstruction in recent years, the University Church of St. Paul in Leipzig is a built palimpsest, symbolizing the evolution in the relation between the role of power in the construction of memory and the transformation of a peculiar physical space. I will briefly reread the main steps of this complex history, to try to draw out of it some of the core dichotomies that built up the contested narratives of this dark heritage, uncomfortable heritage, fallen landmark, and the stratified significances of its postmodernist resurrection. The Paulina Kirche was built in 1231 as the Klosterkirche San Pauli for the Dominican monastery on the Augustenplatz. From the foundation of the University of Leipzig in 1409, as the second most ancient university in Germany, it served as the university church, and it was rededicated as Universitatskirche St. Pauli after the Protestant Reformation. During the Second World War, the entire square of Augustusplatz was heavily bombed, yet the Paulina Kirche survived as the only church which withstood the war almost completely undamaged, standing in the demolished urban space as a rare example of a late Gothic. After the war under GDR regime, the space was renamed Karl Marx Square, and with the rise of the communist state, the propaganda began. The church, with its neo-Gothic facade, turned into an unwanted heritage, icon of a past to be erased. Contrasting again the plans of the head of the GDR, Walter Rubricht, who aimed at making the space, and here I quote him, a modern square through a fully remaking demanded by the socialist order, for which it became blatant and necessary demolition of old stuff. Despite the heated objections, decision was taken by the authorities to wipe it out completely, and protesters against the blasting operation were arrested. On the 30th of May 1968, the church was blown up. The partly damaged Augusteum, including the Albertinum and the Joanneum, were razed to make space for a redevelopment of the university. In the demolition's aftermath, when Karl Square was essentially a parking lot, the prevailing attitude was one of taboo and censorship, and between 1968 and 1978, a new socialist GDR campus was erected on the square. With a 142 meters high university tower designed by Hermann Enselmann in the shape of an open book as a vertical icon, becoming the tallest multi-story building in Leipzig. In 1974, a gigantic bronze monument was erected on the site to celebrate the anniversary of the State of East Germany, named the Aufbruch, or the monument to Karl Marx, embodying the symbolic future for the city's central square. Although the destruction had left the site of the former university church as an open wound in the cityscape, from 1968 onwards, no publication or public speech was mentioned in the demolished historic ensemble. In 1933, 25 years later, the university got rid of the name Karl Marx University, and on the 30th of May, a plaque was inscribed in a corner store on the church, noting its destruction, defined as an arbitrary act, icon of an authoritarian system and symbol of the cultural barbarism perpetrated by the regime. In 1998, an A-frame sculpture in the dimension and the location of the former facade at the Augustusplatz was erected by local artists as a memorial of the vanished church to contrast and disempower the Karl Marx symbol. In 2002, an international competition was launched to find an answer to the dilemma that raised already at the fall of communism in 1989, when opinions started being divided about whether to restore it identical to the original structure, to build a new church with a new image, or to reuse the space with different functions and different purposes. The result of the architectural competition saw a second prize awarded by Beto and Bondisio, the project in the bottom, but no project was awarded as the first prize. So in 2006, the bronze monument to Marx is sent to exile. After debates about the ideological influence and disputes about its destiny, also involving the possibility to bury the gigantic bas-relief together with the rubble of the Pauliner Kirche in the suburb of the city, the 33-ton subject of controversy has been saved by the university, which rejected the dismantling as an iconoclastic gesture and moved it in 2018 to the sport campus far from the center, where it has been installed together with an explanatory text. In 2007, the Pauliner Kirche comes back on Augustenplatz in form of a Gothic postmodernism under the design of the Dutch architect Erik van Egeraat. With the reconstruction as symbolic as its destruction, the new university church is at once an abstraction of the original building complex and an apotheosis of its demolition. The redesign, with its expressivity, inherent part of the postmodern message, raised skepticism under several perspectives. Opponents and proponents of reconstruction came up against it. At the same time, distant from the intention of those in favor of a reconstruction faithful to the original appearance, according to the current trend in Germany to rebuild facsimiles, and also of those praising for the introduction of a contemporary building. Nevertheless, at the same time paying tribute to the lost church and telling the story of its demolition, the resurrected Pauliner Kirche, revealing itself as a contradictory, symbolic, time-making, pluralistic object, seems to be able to incorporate multiple encodings of different statements for different experiences, shifting the communication on several levels at the same time to combat the one vote at the last judge. The silhouette of the new building embodies the paradox of transience, proper of a traumatic, dissonant heritage, by recalling the old church in its shape while reinterpreting its image and meaning. In its being duplicitous, context-dependent, directly related to contingency, this postmodern doppelganger puts into question the very notion of authority by introducing some sort of co-authoriality, or at least it can help to reason on this. That takes place through the overlapped palimpsests displayed by the new building. Inherently authoritarian, it makes the collective as its operative unit, avoiding at the same time a total symbolism that will risk as well to take to authoritarianism. In fact, the new Pauliner Kirche refuses any monumentality by rejecting the symmetry of the original facade, replaced by a new elevation made out of natural stone and glass, which seems to fix, to crystallize the image of the moment of destruction with its asymmetric lines. The rosette and the large stained glass window set slightly off of the center, the tangential line that can be seen in the line continuation of the oval window, aim at expressing the dynamism of the blasting moment and going beyond the mere historical allusion. Against the restoration of any alleged integrity, the building of the new university church works through alteration, corruption, profanation, seeking through details and structural characters to give insight into the past, make reference to history, as in the case of the suspended non-finite columns never touching the floor that at the same time keep the solemn spatiality of the interior and its high level of flexibility. Prescinding the recognition of an original to which the reconstruction should be faithful to, the new Paulinum moves beyond the idea of authenticity. Often dismissed as superficial and condemned as dishonest, the intentions of its postmodernism are rather profound in the layering of strata of history and truthful to all the stages of the urban space. What results is a sort of hyperreality, not only a real without origin or reality, drawing on Baudrillard's definition, but a truth in its own right, a simulacrum able to challenge the notion of origin and reality themselves. Against the diffuse trend to create the most authentic replicas of lost past, and I show here the case of in Potsdam, an analogous demolition, again on order of Walter Rubrick, but that then was reconstructed identical to the original in 2013, the new Pauliner Kirche can be understood as being a real with a plurality of origins and realities, able to incorporate multiple origins and multiple ends, achieved through a combination of abstraction and explicit and provocative historical quotation. And in its use of quotation, it reminds what Umberto Eco said about postmodernism, revolving around the question of how what has already been said in a commercial age can be said again, and answering that the way is to say it in quotation marks. And this is the 1836 Schinkel Portal standing in the World Rave space, and then again, after being pulled from the Augusteum, then first affixed into the GDR campus, then incorporated also into the postmodern facade. Reread as a counter-narrative of preservation, the case of the Pauliner Kirche is at once specific and paradigmatic. This heritage is specific as its postmodern image, and the processes it wants to tell are dramatic rather than playful, recalling in some regards the anti-establishment attitude which characterized the early years of the postmodern phenomenon and style, subversively imposing its iconic image against any master narrative. But at the same time, it can be meant as a paradigm for the contemporary condition of architecture and urban space. In a further effort of translation, it may suggest paradoxical salvage strategies acting to subtractions, demolition, destruction, contrasting the authorized heritage discourses to understand the role that the inheritance plays in contested situation, and this again under a twofold perspective. On the one hand, to support the ongoing heated debates about the preservation of postmodern buildings, of which the controversies about the remodel intervention proposed by Snoetta on Philip Johnson's AT&T building is a famous example, to discuss about the necessity and consequences for this legacy to be placed under protection and to officially enter the heritage realm. And on the other hand, and this hypothesis would sustain the idea that postmodernism is not at all anti-modern, maybe it would be possible to establish a link with the brutalist building currently under threat, opening up a reflection on the possibility to manipulate the concrete inheritance by triggering into them some sort of postmodernization. Seeking multivalence, multiplication of values, self-reflexivity, postmodernism may allow to rediscover a semiotic dimension in which memory and history intertwine and coexist with invention, to liberate heritage from the imprisonment triggered by classical conservation scheme, moving through a double-sided blind transition from a heritage that is embalmed because preserved to a heritage that is preserved right because it evolves. By way of conclusion, this way, the apparent doppelganger, here we see the bronze model that was built in front of the church in 2015 by those that were praising for an exact replica of the original one. It turns into a triadic entity that, drawing on the Hegelian notion of Aufheben, covers the action of annihilating and maintaining, at the same time keeping and abolishing, but also lifting up, sublating, to overcome conflicting and oxymoronic oppositions. With this perspective in mind, postmodernist discursive formation may disclose a form of ambiguity able to communicate overlapped meanings and to reform an identity rooted on alterity, unveiling their inherent dialogical potential, able to foster an evolutionary perspective identified as a way for a legacy to be transmitted and projected towards a myriad of afterlives.
Thank you very much, Giorgia. It was really inspiring. Does anyone has a question? Because I have some, but maybe first I let you to ask if you have. Okay, have you chance to meet Egerat and ask, or Egerat has any statement on what he did at?
I haven't met him personally.
No, not personally, but have you found any
archives? And yes, yeah. Not yet.
But my question was how he declared what he did, how he think of this approach he implemented in this reconstruction, because it was kind of contemporary architecture, more like.
Was kind of?
Some contemporary architecture, what Egerat did anywhere in the world. But can we call it a postmodernist approach, what he did there, or how we think? Do you have any information on this, or not really?
In the documents I found, it doesn't explicitly use the word postmodernism, that it's used instead in the analysis and interpretations of this building, but in the intentions of re-evoking the shape, not only of the original, but also the moment of the destruction. Yes. I find this can be read as
a postmodern
in some ways, yeah.
Okay. So it's your narrative on this building, as I see.
Mine and not only mine, yes. Okay, some readings call this building like that.
Okay, and one more question, that the original building, when it was demolished, any real material, real stones were collected or kept and were used in the new building, or?
All the original has been buried in a hill in the suburb of Leipzig.
Oh, okay.
So the original was completely gone of the building of the church. Yes, but anyway, this case, I think it's useful, especially under a metaphoric perspective. I'm not even judging if I like it or not. But it's useful, especially in this theoretical framework that I'm working on, to try to point out these main dichotomic oppositions, apparently irreconcilable, and how to overcome it. Maybe this building doesn't do that, but it's helpful in raising these questions, especially in this moment in which both postmodern buildings are extremely and increasingly placed under threat, and the brutalist. So, to come to rescue in both cases.
You mentioned the anti-establishment notion of early postmodernism, and in the current debate on reconstruction, there's quite a conservative undertone, and in the current debate in Germany also an accusation of being even right-wing. And in this kind of reenacted postmodernism that you presented, would you see, and did you discover a conservative undertone? Would you agree with that?
in the final phase of the building, in the reconstruction.
Yeah, or in the examples that you presented, that you are labeling with reenacting postmodernism, in contrast to one-to-one reconstruction.
There is a conservative approach. Of course, generally I'm reasoning on this theoretical framework applied to Munich, to Nazi heritage, to authoritarianism, which is very clearly defined as it is. And in that case, the conservative aspect, even today, of how to deal with this building. Now it's ongoing, this huge dispute about in front of the Haus der Kunst, building designed by Hitler with trust, if it's possible to cut the trees that are in front of the facade that were put to hide the monumental Nazi elevation of the building. It's a contradiction in itself, because was it conservative the destruction, or was it conservative the reconstruction? I'm generally against reconstructions, and in Germany this is a very big issue. And the fact is, this building has been able to raise controversies by both sides, nor the conservative nor those who are in favor of new contemporary architecture support this building. This is why I think it's interesting.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any more question? Not really. Just one.
Thanks. So, commemorating not only the previous building, but also the destruction, the moment of destruction of the previous building in a facade is a pretty controversial decision itself. So how is, right now, how is the public opinion in Leipzig about this facade and about this building? What do you know about this?
I think that the opinion is still mainly divided. Of course, this has been felt as a big loss from the moment of its demolition, with these campaigns and with these attempts. This manifesto that at some point I showed, this was put by the students, was a big revolt. Today, after the reconstruction, the opinions are divided. I'm not an expert of Leipzig.
Okay, thank you very much, Giorgia.
Thank you.